Right, and we are live. Good evening, everyone. I'm Sourabhi Dutta Roy, project lead for the Stories of India season 3, and I welcome you all to the 11th episode titled Hot New Releases. Stories of India is brought to you by www.tellmeyourstory.biz, a paperless media that works towards popularizing stories from academic research and social significance in collaboration with global thought leaders. Registrations are now open for the writing program season 6, the last date for registration being May 15, 2022. To know more, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. Today, I'm privileged to have an esteemed panel with us this evening who will discuss the stories from different corners and demographics of India. Before we move on, I would now like to introduce each of our panelists. Miss Annie Zaidi is the author of City of Incident, Prelude to a Riot, and Breath Cement Cactus, a memoir of belonging and dislocation, and the editor of Unbound, 2000 Years of Indian Women's Writing. Her other published works include Gulab, Love Stories 1 to 14, Known Turf, Bantering with Bandits, and Other True Tales, The Good Indian Girl, and Crush. She is the recipient of the Tata Literature Live Award for Fiction 2020, the Nine Dots Prize 2019, and the Hindu Playwright Award 2018 for Untitled One. She has also written and directed several short films and the documentary film, In Her Words, The Journey of Indian Women. We welcome you, ma'am.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Moving on, next we have with us the founder of a suitable agency, Ms. Hemali Sodhi, who has over 2 decades of experience in publishing, communications, and brand strategy. Passionate about books and with a proven expertise in communications and brand management, she has conceptualized and worked on a number of pioneering and award winning marketing campaigns. She loves traveling, reading, and of course, dogs. The Book of Dog, an anthology of original writings edited by her, was published in January 2022. We welcome you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Lovely to be here.
Professor Saikat Majumdar is the author of 4 novels: The Middle Finger, The Scent of God, The Firebird or Playhouse, and Silverfish, a non-fiction college, a book of literary criticism, Prose of the World, and a co-edited collection of essays, The Critic as Amateur. He is also a professor of English and creative writing at Ashoka University and a contributor to various publications, including a book column for the Los Angeles Review of Books. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here as always.
Right. So we begin the session now. Um, my first, well, all three of you released your latest work during or towards the end of the pandemic, if we may call it the end yet. Maybe just begin the session on that note and with great tribute to all authors who have worked hard to restore their headspace and complete their manuscripts. Would all of you like to tell us a little bit about your journey and give us some insights? Amid all the chaos in family and beyond, what is your personal story of keeping that creative soul alive? Um, Professor Mojumdar, if you'd like to take over.
Oh, sure. I thought we were going in alphabetical order, which gives me the benefit of going at the end and putting Annie right there. But okay, since you passed the ball, I think, and once again, thank you for having me. It's a great delight to be here and with such wonderful company. About the pandemic, I should first say that I think we just need to recognize a privilege that it has been disastrous for such a wide section of people right here in India and everywhere. And those of us who've been relatively sort of lucky to be healthy. I mean, I had COVID recently. I mean, but still we came out of it okay, and not have major losses. As a matter of fact, I lost a lot of my birth family when I was younger, so there isn't much family for me to lose anymore. So in a way, that's all taken care of. But so we have been fairly fortunate that way. But I think for writers, it's been a very strange experience. So on one hand, we have lost the world, the lost the ability of stepping out in the streets, going out. I mean, I remember my 10-year-old daughter once said that, I forgot what it's like to feel the air on my face without a mask, the sheer sensory experience of standing and feeling fresh air. So I think for writers, that's a big loss. I always tell my students that all you need to do is to step out in an Indian street, and I think Annie knows that very well. She's written about in her latest book that the epic that's unfolding on Indian streets every day, and that we lost during the pandemic. Um, but ironically, we've also gained, again, those of us who are lucky enough to have this gain, writing space and time. And I think that's very interesting, to be able to stay at home, for me to be able to stay with my kids, my small kids. And it's a very interesting, sometimes infuriating, but enriching experience. For I am very much a writer of memory. I think I cannot write about a situation I'm in, but the moment I step out, I think memory acts as an editor and tells me what is worth remembering. And sometimes it's the most unimportant things that you remember, and that becomes your fiction, which is probably why, while I was in the US all the years, I wrote only about India. And now that I'm living in India, I've written a novel which is significantly set in the US, but also in India. So, in a way, I think there's a sense of longing of things that is absent. And I think in the many ways, the pandemic deepened this longing of the world that we don't have, the world that is absent. And longing makes for great literature, I feel. Longing makes for great art. Something that you have, you don't appreciate. But when it's gone, it comes back to you in a kind of really full way. So I think that really helped. And for this particular novel, it's a strange experience. But the first time I was trying to rewrite a myth, a classical myth or a couple of classical myths in a kind of contemporary setting. Coral would know that very well. She deals with that domain. And I think in that sense, I already knew the story, what the story was going to be. But I was trying to set it inside the world of campus, a contemporary college campus or multiple college campuses in the US and India. And that was also something we were really missing. Campus life was gone. We were teaching our classes on Zoom. In fact, 2 years, of two batches of students have really kind of graduated, have had their graduation online. And there are students who were joined in their first year, and now they're suddenly in their fourth year. 2 years of the college have gone by. And I think it came out of a sense of missing campus life, great sense of missing campus life, that what I don't have. At the same time, I was writing a lot of columns. I write columns on education, higher education, and the pandemic really deepened the inequities, the unfairness in the world of education. As some of you must know, that there was a young woman at Lady Shriram College who committed suicide because she could not afford a laptop. And I think Zoom classes, digital learning has made it evident to what degree our world is divided. There are stories about rural India, sort of school kids getting on top of trees to get proper signal, attending classes on a single mobile phone. And I think all of these sort of play. I was writing columns about these things, but in some ways, when you're trying to rewrite the Ekalavya myth in a contemporary college campus, the whole question of who gets access to education, who doesn't, and how the pandemic has deepened our inequalities, how the pandemic has brought it to surface. Here you have a social class who are setting up complete game rooms, and PlayStation 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever, I don't know. There all these Minecraft things are going around. And on the other hand, you have people who are really fighting over a single phone on which to attend classes, do their businesses. And so in many ways, this was a extremely humbling time. It was an extremely humbling time, a deeply illuminating time. Even though we were confined, we were thrown into the middle of the world in a kind of terrifying way. And I think for a writer, it's been a very disturbed time in a sense, but internally, I think I have gained so many insights. And I think, I hope some of that has come out in what I've written during that time. So thank you. That's a great question.
Right, sir. Ms. Sodhi, over to you.
No, so first I have to say thank you very much for inviting me. I feel honored being amongst this very distinguished company. I've been reading fantastic reviews and notices of both Saikat and Annie's books. I also feel a bit of an imposter syndrome kicking in because here are two really, really accomplished and very prolific writers. So the book of Dog that I've just brought out is actually an edited anthology. It contains 45 contributions and 45 pieces from writers, from animal activists. And it's interesting how the pandemic played a role in this because I had thought about this book. I had thought about the idea of doing a sort of a homage to dogs a while ago, a few years ago. But it's only when the pandemic happened and the world around us was falling apart and no one really knew what was happening, and we were all at home for this really long, unexpected period of time. Um, and I thought the dogs were the most calming and the most comforting presence that I had, and a lot of other dog parents that I know and I regularly interact with had. I thought that this was actually the time to sit and do this book. So I reached out to animal lovers. I reached out to dog parents. I reached out to writers. I knew I'd exchanged a lot of stories with. But the difference here was that unlike writing a novel, which can be a solitary process, editing an anthology is the exact opposite, because you're actually you're in touch with so many people. There's a lot of conversation. There's a lot of development of how each piece would work out. So in that sense, it was actually interesting how the whole process happened. The universe expanded. People were suggesting other dog parents who should be writing pieces. So I think, it did take over 2 years for us to put the whole anthology together. But I think the interesting bit is that our inspiration, which is dogs, was actually was something that brought us very even closer together during the pandemic, because we were at home. I think in terms of how the writers and the animal activists reacted, though, it was again interesting because, like Saikat says, it was an unusual time. On the one hand, you had all this unexpected time with your family and with your colleagues, but on the other hand, there was this entire uncertainty, and you saw what was happening around. And I think perhaps this book was also a kind of distraction. People did want to sit and write about this very positive presence. So I think in that sense, it served that purpose. What was sad also was, and we'll talk about that a bit later, but the fact is that dogs have short lives. So a lot of the dogs that are featured in the book, some of them passed away. So it's been this entire contained universe of dog lovers and dog stories and dog parents over these past 2 years. And I think the pandemic was just that time to sit down and actually do this tribute to our best friends, as we call them.
All right. Ms. Zaidi, over to you.
Thank you, Sourabhi. In my case, it's been a very strange, actually. For me, 2 years of the pandemic have kind of bookended two books. When the pandemic began, I was just releasing. I had already written my book, Bread, Cement, Cactus, which was a memoir that had already kind of been in the works for the year before that. It was supposed to be launched in the UK in April, May. Just before lockdown, I remember one of my most clear memories of the pandemic starting up was that I had applied for a visa and I had given my passport to the VFS, etc. And then I heard rumors that lockdown is being announced and it will be announced very suddenly on the last minute. And I panicked thinking, oh my God, they've got my passport. What if they lose it? So I dashed across town to pick that passport up. But of course, lockdown was announced the same evening. And after that, there was no question of me actually going anywhere with that book. So there was no launch. There was no there were no discussions. There was no reading. And obviously that as a writer, that does affect you. And the book was then published in India. But even within India, I couldn't travel because, 6 months, it was impossible. So this went on, and the book, I did what I could online. But even online, I remember I was struggling. Professor Majumdar mentioned, and very rightly so, that all the inequities just kind of floated up to the surface in the beginning, in the lockdown. And even though with all my privilege and everything, my life was sort of between two cities at the time. I was somewhere between Bombay, Pune, and Lucknow during the pandemic. And a Wi-Fi had got disconnected in one place. So even though it wasn't a question of not having the money for it, it was the question of not being allowed in the beginning and during the pandemic. I couldn't summon somebody to come to my house and connect the a wire, actual physical wire needed to be replaced, and nobody could come. And I spent a month on my phone, somehow struggling to get this done. Didn't happen. Ultimately, I was doing interviews on the phone, and the quality of the recordings was so poor. I remember one BBC interview fell through for that reason. The quality was so poor that even though they did interview me, they couldn't broadcast it. So the first year was extremely difficult. I also started teaching during the pandemic. I was teaching full time, but online only, and that was also a little bit disconcerting for me because I have taught very short courses before, but at a proper university teaching, not being able to see your students, not being able to see how whether or not they were relating to anything that you were saying. So 1 year was spent that way. I didn't write at all. I couldn't write. I have always worked from home as a freelancer. So for me, this was also a bit of a shock to discover that I thought that, my life isn't changing in any significant way, reading and writing wise. It was changing in other ways, of course. You couldn't go out for any purpose at all. But for some reason, I don't know what happened. It was like a switch flipped in my head. And creative writing wise, I couldn't write anything. I continued to teach a little bit and wrote 1 or 2 articles for newspapers and websites, but I didn't write anything for a year. I already had a manuscript. City of Incident was, I think almost finished before the pandemic. I did only one final draft in 2021, like after things began to open up, etc. I also did have COVID, and then after I recovered, I did my final draft, and then it was released late last year. And yeah, again, I haven't done any events, I haven't attended anything, and I think the sense of the book actually being there, it is there as a tangible object, it is there, but there is something about not being able to go out, I haven't even been to bookstores to do signings or anything. So it does feel as if it's not really out, feels a little strange, I have to say.
Right. Ms. Zaidi, in your book, The City of Incident, a novel in 12 parts, you have shown various images of city life through different characters from different stratas of society and also different age groups. Their issues also differ depending upon who they are, but each story is vibrant with characters embedded into a busy city life. Um, would you please, but they also talk about the different kinds of loneliness and isolation. Would you please discuss this contrast?
Hmm. Yeah, I don't name the city, and I think in some ways the book would sort of serve as a kind of template for any very large city. I think it's got loads of people in it. It's got inequity, and it's got trains and buses and transport systems, etc. But I think people who do live in Bombay, in Mumbai, they would obviously very quickly recognize the very few references that I have given it. That is now, I think I've lived in various places, but that is the city where I spent the most amount of time. And I've seen the city change and grow, but also I came to the city. I grew up in very small places, and I came into a very large city only as an adult after my graduation. And I do remember, especially in the beginning, when you come, especially when you come in as a migrant, or even if you've grown up in a city, if you experience the city the way I experienced it, what I find is that there is a lot of loneliness and isolation in cities. And a lot of it is not physical isolation because there's too many people around all the time, but it is emotional and psychological. And cities, the thing is with cities also, cities are made of migrants. They're made for migrants and by migrants. So there's multiple kinds of loneliness built in. First is the kind of loneliness that comes from having left behind everything that was familiar and your support networks, your social networks, all of that. And there's a second kind of isolation that comes from not having the means to do too much. You might be living in a very crowded kind of society, say in a building where there's tons of people, you have a very tiny house, you don't have any privacy, etc. But even there, if you don't have the means with which to reach out to the people you want in your life, or create a space for yourself into which other people can be invited in say, safe and pleasant ways, that can create a very specific kind of isolation and loneliness. And then there is the loneliness that inequity kind of engenders, where you see yourself as other, and even if you are not poor yourself, there is the loneliness of the poor because they cannot access the things they need, and they experience that isolation, kind of economic and social isolation. If they have support groups, then it is not such a bitter kind of isolation. But if they don't, then it can be dangerous for them. Then there is the isolation that comes from people who are in the upper classes not being able to cross the class divide, to see another person, but to see them only as the other, as somebody whom you cannot imagine in your life or being able to build bonds with them. And this is true of all cities everywhere, where people kind of make themselves isolated by the divisions that they've got in their own head. And I was looking at all this, and I think one of the things that has always struck me about large cities, especially Mumbai, is that there is so much, a very intense kind of socialization that happens. You go to the you go to the beach on weekends, and it is so crowded that sometimes you can't see the sea. You just see the sea of people before you see the waves, you know. And you also see that in that sea of people, a lot of people are just standing alone and not say talking to each other. Sometimes you see entire families out there, and except for the children, nobody looks very happy or is not communicating with each other. And you also see that in trains and buses, people who don't know each other at all are just chatting, sharing food, singing. And then you also see people who are extremely lonely, who are sitting there or talking to people on the phone, but fighting all the time. And these images kind of got stuck in my head. The when I see people and I can see that they're lonely, it doesn't mean they're lonely for all their lives. Obviously, I'm not seeing all their lives. But when I see them in that moment of loneliness, I'm kind of struck by that image, and I begin to wonder what is causing this loneliness, especially when they're surrounded by people all the time. So that kind of moved me to try and explore some of those images through building up the stories, that the 12 stories that connect into this novel. But yeah, I think most people will vouch for the fact that large cities and long commutes and the lack of community life, of local community life, the lack of local community initiatives can often make a person in a large city much lonelier than they need to be.
Right. Moving on to Miss Sodhi, you mentioned in your book, The Book of Dogs, that dogs teach us about unconditional love and kindness when they come into our lives, and then again they teach us about the pain of loss as they depart. How did you come about this catharsis of events in real life, and how did that experience perhaps help structure the anthology?
I think losing a dog is always devastating. Um, and you think that you can actually try and articulate this or put this in words or try and make sense of it. And but I think I have always struggled with this, so I won't sugarcoat this. I think so. I grew up quite afraid of dogs. So my story is a bit sort of strange in the sense that I wasn't born a dog lover. I actually took to dogs fairly late in life. And then when the first dog entered my life, it was entirely transformative. Um, Losing him was very, very tough. But I think what it also teaches you, if you choose to learn a lesson from that, is that dogs live in the moment, right? Dogs are what you see is what you get. I think some of the most profound lessons I have learned have been from dogs, which is just live in the moment, love, forgive, don't carry baggage, and I just choose to focus on that now. I just choose to focus on the here and now with the dogs that we have. Um, in terms of how that affected the structure of the book, I think naturally when the pieces started coming in, a lot of them actually did talk about the loss, did talk about the individual loss and how it devastated people. And I think sometimes you also come across people who say, dog parents who say, after they lose a dog, never again. I don't think I can go through the pain ever again. And I respect that as well. I mean, I know what it is. But then I think, is that something that I would trade for this wonderful, unconditional, humongous, abundant love? Um, what I find is the most purest relationship, one of the most purest relationships that you're going to have. Am I going to trade that for this? No. So I think the lesson really is acceptance. The lesson really is enjoy the now. The lesson really is, you know, nothing lasts permanently. I mean, if you think about a lot of the relationships that you would have, even with, say, your grandparents, you know, at some point that there will be there will be loss. That doesn't mean that you stop loving them or you love them less. I think it just means that you appreciate the now a bit more. In terms of the structure, again, like I said, there are pieces in the book. There are pieces which are silly, there are pieces which are funny, there are pieces which talk about the transformative nature, but yes, there are a fair number of pieces about loss. And I think if you're a dog parent, that really is part of it's part of the life of dog parents. So you will see the whole gamut of from the time a dog enters your life to the time you have to say bye, what happens there, and what are the memories that you choose to live with.
Right. Moving on to Professor Majumdar. Sir, your book, The Middle Finger, talks about various societal norms and hierarchies that exist in between the educational systems, all the while blurring the lines between the mentor and the student. As a professor yourself, do you experience such blurring of lines on campus? And would you prefer this change, would you treat this change as a welcome change, or would you would you ideally discourage it?
Yeah, I think all the time. This happens all the time because teaching is itself a kind of a learning. It's not a mechanical passage of information from one agent to another. And especially if you're teaching something like literature, the arts, creative writing, which is what I teach, it's very much an exchange. And of course, I do know more than them. I am so-called more of a professional than them. But I think everybody brings something to literature. Everybody brings something. And nobody who's lived life, nobody who has experienced, doesn't bring anything. So I think in some ways, arts are a domain where amateur intervention is actually more welcome. You can't be an amateur surgeon or an amateur lawyer, but an amateur playwright, I think is sometimes more welcome than a professional, or an amateur painter. Some of the greatest writers, and so I think in some ways this difference between the expert and the professional, the teacher and the student, is already blurred because we are always learning. Everybody is always learning.
Uh,
His connection seems to have stalled.
um, I think I'll just move on to Ms. Zaidi once more, and when Professor Majumdar joins us again, I'll just um, let him carry on. So, Ms. Zaidi, you have given voice and face to the passing apparitions in a metropolis in your book. I call them apparitions because most of these are characters that we don't think about much or even talk about, even if we converse with them for a need. How did such characters come to you? How did such characters come to you, given that you too stay in a crazy city where everyone in their must in their settlements must be unsettled? What is your backstory, and what made you notice them?
Hmm. Um, yeah, it's funny you should call them apparitions actually, because so much of this book is actually very grounded. That the the way I've written them, they might appear to be sort of fleeting encounters, and there's something shadowy and intangible about um, the lives of the people I'm describing. But a lot of this actually comes from having lived in the city and having seen and talked to the people, heard them from lived experience. And I think me being a journalist had a lot to do with it. I studied media. I came to the city in order to study media, and then I found a job and I continued there. And as a reporter, and even before that, of course, just working in the city involves getting out, using public transport, encountering people in a very intense way. It's very seriously intense. I mean, when people say that, I have written this in the book too, and it is literally true that somebody's elbow is grinding into your chest, your nose is in somebody's armpit, and it is literally like that. It's an intensely physical experience, and it's difficult to forget, and it's very difficult to get used to. I mean, I did it for more than 15 years, and I still can't get used to it, because every time you are pushed up that close, just hard pressed against this tangible bodies around you, there is discomfort. There is a very sharp awareness of other people and what's going on with them, what's going on with you. And I could not separate myself from other people so easily. That was one part of it. And the second part of it was, being a journalist, you see much more. Um, you see people, you have a little bit of perhaps a sense of how the city functions and how people function in the city. You hear about things, you pay more kind of closer attention to the news. I mean, you're not just a reader, you're also paying attention to the news. You're aware of the processes that will unfold now. Because, like, if somebody falls, okay, the police is going to step in like this now. Now, these people are responsible for XYZ kind of task that needs to be accomplished. If somebody is cut down by a train on the tracks, what is going to happen next? These are things that people are very dimly aware of, but as a journalist, I was a little bit more aware of those processes, and I think some of that fed into the writing of the novel. And also, me reading the newspapers a little more closely. Like, for many years, I read 3 4 papers a day. Every day there's one little news item, and the news item might be just something like somebody has an accident, falls off a tower, but then you actually go to these places, and then you think about them as well. That, what are the different possibilities? You look at the news every day, you begin to see patterns about how people behave in the city and what cities do to people. So I think all of that was kind of feeding into uh, my interaction with the city. And then I created these characters, and some of these characters I was just playing with to see, okay, what if I see this cop in the ladies compartment. I see a cop every day, right? And if I see, it's not always the same cop, but if I begin to write about one cop, the other cops kind of amalgamate into this character, and he becomes then one cop. I see this girl travel. I don't see the same girl travel every day, but I see a girl like her travel every day. So I amalgamate 2 or 3 different characters and make the character of this girl who dresses like this, who is subject to these pressures, and who might encounter these kind of people in on her daily commutes. So then it goes from there, kind of you see something very tangible, very specific, but then you also experience the city and the lives of people around you, and you create these characters that are sort of with whom with whom I have a very tangible relationship. You, as the reader, may not. And for you, it might be something much more intangible and shadowy. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, right. Moving on to Professor Majumdar, I think you lost your connection. Yeah, you were talking about the blurring of lines.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, I lost power for a moment. My city had an incident, so there was a loss of power. But I'm back. No, I was just saying that your I think a wonderful question about the blurring of the roles. As I was saying, it happens all the time, and I think we always learn from our students. Um, and I think one particular example that happens a lot is in the English classroom. English literature and writing in English are fairly elite affairs in India because of our colonial heritage. There are only a certain kind of people who study English, or write in English. Engineering tends to be much more where people look for more diversity. But once in a while, you get a student who say is not very comfortable in English, comes from a different kind of a background, and yet is really interested in studying literature, maybe writing in English. And then you realize they are very well read in maybe another literary tradition. Maybe they're very well read in Hindi. Maybe they're very well read in Bangla. Maybe they're very well read in some other language, but their English is not necessarily great. And then I think it's a wonderful moment, a challenging moment for the teacher, that how do you harness this energy? Because at the end of the day, literature, though it's about language, in a curious way it also transcends language. That, and I think all of us here who write in English are also haunted by the energy of the local Indian languages. I mean, I read a lot in Bangla, and the other Indian languages also in translation enter my writing. They challenge my sense of craft, in many ways, even though I got my MFA in the US, and they're revising, and these moments happen. So when you meet a student like that, who you can see is struggling with the excess, not having access to a certain kind of elite baggage of English, the kind of schools and colleges which many people come from, what do you do? How do you work that? And I think in many ways that was also the defining moment, for me writing this novel, because obviously when Drona met Ekalavya, and Ekalavya wanted knowledge from him, and Drona said, I can't teach you because you're not a prince and you're not of the class. And I realize that happens every day in our universities, that happens every day when we meet. And it's not just about who you are, but what kind of worldview you bring, what kind of access to knowledge you have. And whether, okay, fine, I don't have I don't have a thumb, but I'm going to show certain power with the middle finger, as Wendy Doniger's version of that. And I think this is in many ways the teacher-student relationship gets blurred here. That it becomes a learning moment for the teacher, a learning moment for the teacher who has a certain kind of education, to face a student comes from a radically different background. And I think a good teacher is one who learns in these moments and revises one teaching. And it's a very large process. Like even things like admissions are structured in a way to benefit students from a certain kind of schooling. And this is a problem in the US too. It's a very suburban white intelligence that gets tested, in IQ tests, in all this GRE, SAT. How do we change those things? So I think the teacher student relationship is always blurred. And I think, and a sensitive teacher who can jump on these moments and alternate and kind of learn from it. And I think socially also the relationship between teacher and the student is very fluid. It changes from culture to culture. In the West, of course, it's more socially more relaxed. Here I find things are more hierarchical. And of course, most of all, I think, as we all know, after the Me Too movement rocked the world, especially of media and academia, it has seriously sort of made relationships different. So I think in those things too, that what are the social boundaries between a teacher and a student, when Can you go out for, is it okay to coffee with a student but not a beer? You know, what do you do? What are the circumstances? You know, when do you? So all these things have really sort of made things very sort of interesting but very explosive, because especially when you're teaching something artistic, something literary, there's always a spark. It becomes very personal. I'm sure it's very personal in the sciences too, but I know in the arts and the humanities it's personal in a way. It almost doesn't remain limited, it becomes an intimate relationship. But so there are all kinds of blurrings that happen and all kinds of knowledges that come out of that blurring, but there are also a lot of dangerous things. So in many ways, I felt this is Guru Shishya relationship, this Gurukul, this Ekalavya Drona relationship, you know, in is such a important one that I kind of had to write a contemporary campus novel which delineates it. And I don't think it's really limited to the university, because mentorship is important everywhere. It's important in politics, it's important in the corporate world, it's very important in the literary world, you know. And you know, how do you negotiate that? Where do you draw the line?
Oh God, his connections. Um,
Power's gone again.
I'll just carry on with Miss Sodhi. Ma'am, those who have never had pets don't always understand the attachment of the pet lovers. How does a pet, especially a dog, change lives? And it would be nice if you could include some of the touching moments from the various contributions in your book.
I like how we go from cities to creative writing to pandemic to dogs. It's it's quite lovely. Um, so yes, I part of the reason of an anthology like that is because as dog parents, a lot of us feel like dogs actually occupy a very important part of our lives. Um, they are family, but you don't actually see them in a lot of narratives in the mainstream, either books or any form of entertainment or reading. You don't really come across, or maybe I'm reading the wrong books, but I haven't read that many books around dogs as a central character. Interestingly, there were when you're growing up and you're reading children's literature, you do come across a lot of dogs, and a lot of dogs are actually your heroes, whether it's Snoopy or it's Snowy or it's I mean, so but that somewhere changes as you grow older. You have dogs, but they are very much like supporting characters. So I think that was why the idea of making this central to the narrative came about. In terms of the effect of a dog in your life, I mean, I think this is really something you have to go through to understand. But like I said, I wasn't born a dog lover, but when I had our first dog, it was life changing. I think it was this moment where I felt completely, irrevocably in love with Simba, who was our first dog, and it was just it just made me view things in a different way. Um, I think what it also did was, in a lot of ways, it gave me perspective in terms of what really is critical and what's not. So, you'd come back, you'd have this day when you're thinking about work, when you're thinking about that argument or that conversation, and there you have your dog. And the need of the moment is playing with Simba. And the need of the moment is taking him for a walk. And then you sit back and you realize, okay, what really in the scheme of things is really something you want to concentrate your energies on. I've also found dogs to be therapeutic. I have always felt that in moments of deep stress, in moments of when I need comfort, I turn to my dogs. We've always had, after Simba, I mean, we became these serial dog adopters, or rather, dogs adopted us. So we've always had a lot of dogs in our lives. Um, Having said that, this is a book which is not mine alone. I have just curated it, as I said. There are 45 writers, and each experience that the writer talks about or brings is unique to them. So, for instance, you have very moving pieces from the animal rescuers, how they started, what is that one incident that changed their life. Menika Gandhi talks very, very passionately, very eloquently about the dog in her life. There are two people who talk about how they get into animal rescue, but equally, people talk about their relationships with their dogs in different ways. So there is a piece by Naomi Barton, who's actually a debut writer, who talks about how when she got Melody in her life, it was at a particularly difficult moment, and that actually became, there's this saying that it's not us who rescue dogs, it's dogs who really rescue us, and that really that essay is a perfect embodiment of that. There's Ananya Vajpayee's essay where it's a story of having to give her dogs away and how she brought them back. Shobha Day talks about her unique relationship with her dog Gongli, and it's remarkable because she sees Gongli as this person, this female embodiment of someone who's really strong, who loves her but needs her space. So I mean, I think every relationship is very, very individual and very different. Gulzar Saab talks about his dog Pali. It's a beautiful poem about moments of solitude, but also moments of companionship that he spends with his dog. And similarly, these 45 stories and 45 essays, most of them are personal recollections or personal stories. They each talk about the individual dogs in their lives and the effect and the relationship that they've had with that particular dog. Was there another part to your question? Sorry, have I answered that?
No, ma'am. Yes, you've answered. That was
Thank you.
well. While we wait for Professor Majumdar, I'd uh, uh, which image of and this is for both of you. Which image of contemporary India, its culture, its heritage, identity, and its people, played in your minds, which may have affected the storytelling? And if you must pick one specific issue of the country which your book is consciously vocal about, which one would it be, and why? Like, if you would want to see a change in that issue. Um, Ms.
Sorry,
Zaidi?
Abby, do you want to go first?
No, I'm still thinking. So if you can go first, that would be nice. It's a
Sure.
tough question.
Sure. It is. It is. But for me, I think it's also a pretty straightforward question in the sense that I think that there is not enough awareness about animal cruelty. We don't really know what the laws are. You always hear about human animal conflict. So, part of one of the something that really disturbs a lot of us is where you have these RWAs and you have this stress between people who want to feed animals and people who turn around and say you can't. I think the way we view dogs and their part in society needs a bit of a different mindset and a different change. I think we have to be more inclusive in terms of if we think they are family members and they are such so important in our lives. I think we have to recalibrate how we view dogs. But what really, really bothers me is that even now, the fines for animal cruelty, for instance, are very, very low. I think it's some 50 rupees or something. A lot of people who would like to help dogs or who are into feeding or animal welfare don't really know what their rights are. So I think, I mean, and part of several essays in the book do talk about that. Another thing is, of course, this whole thing of there's a movement called Adopt Don't Shop, where there we say that there are so many dogs who are actually looking for homes, so many dogs who need to be rescued. People should go and think of them first when they want to include a dog in their lives, rather than go and buy a dog from a backyard breeder. Breeders don't really follow ethics. So I think for me, it's really the whole universe that needs to be thought about in terms of how we include pets and especially dogs in our lives.
Ms. Zaidi, over to you.
Owen, it's a very complex question, but from the lens of my book, which is about cities, I think I would say that um, the one thing that I think very large cities lack, two things actually. The first is housing. Um, we don't yet in India have a conversation around housing rights. We have some sense of, okay, people should not be homeless, vague kind of conversation around that. So the government will give you money if you're homeless and very poor to build housing. There have been, the Indira Awas Yojana and all of that, and you get some grant through some bureaucratic process and you try and build a house. But in a country where you don't have land rights, what does it mean to be given uh, money to build a house? Where would you build a house? And in a city where real estate is that expensive, where would you build a house? There is some conversation around, okay, slum rehabilitation, but there is no conversation around the fact that you do have a right even to build a jhopparpatti. If I am, say, a migrant worker, right? If I am being brought into the city, and most of us are migrants in some fashion, but say I'm being brought in to work on a building, or to work as somebody's domestic helper, or to work in care, giving nursing, all those things, right? If I do not have housing in the city, if the government or state is not giving me even temporary rental accommodation guarantees, then by default you are condemning me, damning me to homelessness, right? And then you're forcing me to break the law by building a jhopparpatti, because where will that person go? Of course, that person is going to live somewhere, right? He will either sleep on the pavement, then there is the sun, there is the rain, there are the elements. So that person is going to put up some kind of temporary shelter. And if that person continues to work, and most people do actually, there's this myth about people not being productive in society. A lot of people are unemployed because they would like wages and employment in a steady way, but people do contribute to society, right? Now, where are these people going to go? They are going to do some little work for you, maybe 2 hours a day, maybe 12 hours a day. That's besides the point. Is there going to be this assumption, this kind of there is this there is by not passing laws of a certain kind, you condemn people to by default make them lawbreakers. And housing really is part of the right to life. The right to health is meaningless. The right to education is meaningless if you can't also give people housing rights. So one does need to build this conversation around people to say, one, that every citizen has the right to be housed. Now, in other countries, there is some kind of concept of, say, council housing. The municipality or the local town or the village, whatever it is, there are empty buildings or there is state land, housing will be created, and you may not own that place, but you will be housed in some fashion. You will be protected. You won't be out in the street. India needs to get there too, especially in our cities, because there isn't surplus land. And then if people do spend time, money, labor to create something that the state has not created, and then to destroy that by saying that, that, oh, but that was illegal and you have no rights, or to be offered something that is much worse. A lot of the slum rehabilitation housing is not really habitable. It's there won't be lifts there, there won't be community support networks there, water, electricity might be a problem. So those kind of things have to be figured out, and I think a lot of my characters in the book would certainly benefit from that security. And I think people, it generally makes for a better polity, a better society, where we all understand and acknowledge that the right to have food, clothing, and shelter is inalienable. And of course, anti-discrimination. That is also implicit there, where whether you are being discriminated against because of your caste or religion or gender, single people, singlehood status are often discriminated against. So all those things need to be factored into the right to housing. And the second thing that I would say is right to public transport. I mean, cheap and affordable public transport is also a vital right. Cities cannot function. I mean, Bombay is a great city partly because it has had great public transport.
Right. Um, we are sorry that we couldn't be joined by Professor Majumdar after he switched off because of an unavoidable issue. It is quite unfortunate, but we will try to bring him back some other time. Professor Majumdar has conveyed his apologies. Nonetheless, thank you once again to Ms. Annie Zaidi, Ms. Hemali Sodhi, and Professor Saikat Majumdar for today's wonderful and insightful conversation, and also for your time this evening. I truly enjoyed moderating the panel. With this, we come to an end of the 11th episode titled Hot New Releases under Stories of India, brought to you by www.tellmeastory.biz. Just a reminder, registrations are now open for the writing program, season 6, the last date for registration being 15 May 2022. The next episode of Stories of India Season 3 will feature Professor Makarand Palanjape speaking on his latest book, Identity's Last Secret. Till then, stay well, stay safe, stay happy. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, Sophie. Yeah, good night.